So one of the topics that work group members identified as being of interest to you guys is considerations for evaluation in rural and very rural communities. And so obviously there's always some unique challenges when you're working in very rural communities and especially in Alaska. So we decided to make this one of our learning topics. These are some of the challenges that I put together. So drilling down secondary data, especially to the local level, a lot of our data sources that are out there are statewide or on a regional basis, but really getting it down to that very small community level can be difficult to do due to small numbers of people and then also due to that confidentiality component of it. A lot of times the data ends up being suppressed because there's not enough information or there's fears of breach of confidentiality. A few people doing everything. I think this plays into the survey fatigue, evaluation fatigue, research fatigue, that there's generally in small communities, you have a few people that are participating in everything and they get asked over and over and over and over again to provide. And people only have so much time and so much energy to contribute to the cause. Fewer people to survey. So in our rural and very rural communities, we have much smaller population numbers. So it can be difficult to get enough responses to things like surveys to really be able to draw conclusions. And there's several reasons that can happen, not just fewer people to survey, but also some of those reasons of trust and confidentiality, and people are concerned that something they say might get out to the community. Survey fatigue, I don't think I need to say any more about that. Concerns about confidentiality and anonymity. Tesha highlighted sometimes getting things like local EMS data can be difficult because they don't want to release private or confidential information about individual members of the community. This can also play into interviews and focus groups that we do with community members, that people may be hesitant to participate because they're concerned. Again, that's something that they say could get out to the community or not be received well or traced back to them. One of you mentioned this, that the funder requirements and some of the data that you're required to collect don't always align with community priorities. So sometimes, we might be funded by a particular grant program that wants you to collect certain data, and it just doesn't seem relevant to the work you're doing or to your community. We also have the challenge of community calendars, especially in very rural communities. With evaluation, the evaluation can't necessarily happen on the evaluator's timeline or the project's timeline. There's other things at play, things like subsistence harvest calendars. When are we going to be able to work with community members to get the information we need? There might be community events. There might be certain circumstances in the community that impact the evaluation timeline. Lack of trust in outsiders and or in evaluation or in research, and we've talked about that quite a bit already. Trust in relationships and how do we navigate that? And then finally, I put on a challenge of the digital divide. In some ways, this is getting lessened by increased access to high-speed internet throughout the state. But there's still a whole piece of we really need to pay attention to what types of technology are available in a community, what types of technology are people comfortable working with and communicating with. In a lot of very rural communities, for instance, email communication doesn't work well. We need to pick up the phone and talk with people. So these are all things that we need to take into account. So there's a lot of challenges, but the important message that I want to get across to people today is that these challenges are not insurmountable and we can work around them. So lots of challenges. There are also some advantages to evaluation in rural and very rural communities. I love working with rural communities. I can't remember who it was in our introductions who mentioned that your piece of advice was to have fun. But I think working with rural and very rural communities can be very fun because we have opportunities to do innovative work and to be really creative with the work that we're doing. Jumping back to that piece of relationships, we really have the opportunity to build good relationships with members of the community and leverage those relationships to help us with the evaluation. Along with those relationships, it can also be easier to build collaborations with local organizations to get data Sometimes when you're in larger communities, you kind of keep running into firewalls with getting access to data, but often in rural communities, it's easier to get that type of data. We also have an opportunity to develop resources that are really meaningful for the community. We talked a little bit about the relevance of data, and when we're working with a small community, we really have that opportunity to say, what do you want to know? What information about this topic is going to be useful for you? And again, those relationships that we build can support future work with the community. So those relationships will continue to pay off. They take time to build, they take effort to build, but those relationships will continue to pay off well into the future. Jen and I were emailing back and forth a little bit the other day about like what are the key factors in evaluation in rural communities. And these two will come up time and again in evaluation. Relationships and time are so important in evaluation, but they're even more important when we're working with rural and very rural communities. I also just want to point out this, it kind of seems obvious, but really explicitly pointed out that relationships and time are not independent of each other. It takes time to build relationships. It can take years to build those relationships that we need to really successfully do evaluation. And the more time we spend in communities, the better those relationships become. The better the relationships become, we often end up spending more time in the communities. So they really work together. And we're going to talk about a couple different aspects of that time as well. When we were talking about challenges, one of you brought up the inclusion of people with lived experience in the evaluation. And another really important piece is to include the community in the evaluation. So participatory evaluation is a really good way to do that. And I'm sure most of you have probably heard of this term before, but really the idea is that the community is our partner in the evaluation. We are not evaluating them. We're working together with the community to do the evaluation. So the community collaborates with us in determining what are the evaluation questions. So the questions are, what do we want to know from the evaluation? Really working back and forth with community members to determine what those questions are. The community works with us in determining the timeline for the evaluation. It doesn't work to come in and say, in October we're going to do this, in January we're going to do this, in May we're going to do this, and in August we're going to do this. When you're working with communities, there may be major community events. Maybe we can't do anything in May because May is fishing season and everybody's going to be out fishing, or maybe there's a large event going on that we want to avoid doing anything around that large event. So that timeline is a really important piece. We also work with the community in determining what methods are going to be best for the evaluation. I've experienced where we've come into a community and wanted to do a survey and then got feedback from the community like, we cannot do another survey right now. We have survey fatigue going on, that fatigue thing that we talked about. So then we might come up with another method that would be more or that would be better received by the community. Also working with the community in terms of the deliverables. So what kind of report does the community want? Does the community want, a very academic report, or does the community want a 2-page summary of the findings? So really, or does the community want a presentation? So what's going to be useful for the community to do with this information? Participatory evaluation also provides us with the opportunity to coordinate or embed our evaluation activities with other efforts going on in the community. So again, if we get that conversation going with community members, maybe there's another evaluation project already going on that's somewhat similar, and maybe we can do things like work on combining surveys or use data from each other's evaluation to inform the two evaluations. So there's lots of opportunities there. We also often will have the community help facilitate introductions for us. So if you have relationships with a couple key people in the community, they can help facilitate those introductions with other people in the community that might be helpful for completing the evaluation. And those introductions could just be a simple email introduction all the way down to, let me walk you over to Joe's house and introduce you to him because I think he would be really helpful for you. And of course, participatory evaluation really respects the sovereignty of communities. It honors that the communities are in charge of making their own decisions and have a say in the process. One thing I really wanted to highlight too is that often the process of evaluation is as important as the outcome of the evaluation. So the process of working together and developing these relationships and discovering the questions together and gathering the data together and looking at the data together, that process is often super, super valuable. And we have the outcomes that we need from the evaluation, but again, that process is what leads to those relationships. So the process both requires the relationships, but it also helps build the relationships. It helps build the trust as well, and can also build the community capacity. The challenge is that that process requires a lot of time and a lot of money. And money's always the reality check at the end, is there's a certain budget to work with and how much time do we have to complete this task. Okay, so I wanted to talk about time a little bit. We talked in the beginning, I talked about relationships are important and time is important. So there's a couple different aspects of time. So there's the time spent in communities. It is just so valuable when you're working with rural and very rural communities to spend time in the community. And not just time doing the work, but time just getting to know community members, participating in community or cultural events that are happening, walking around the community, seeing what's important to the community. And that builds those relationships. This is one of those things that costs a lot of money to spend time in communities. You need to travel there and you need to spend several days there. But if you have the luxury to spend time with the community, that's really important. Also, another aspect of time is just slowing down. So it's very easy to go into a rural or a very rural community and we have our agenda and we want to get it done. And we're used to sitting down at our desk and, okay, what do I have to do today? What do I have to accomplish? But really slowing down and taking the time to listen and slowing down our conversations, allowing plenty of time to have those conversations with people. Interviews, especially, schedule extra time just to have some conversation in the beginning of an interview for the person to become comfortable talking with you, to get to know each other a little bit on a personal level. Um, the more comfortable people are in interviews, the more willing they're going to be to share information with you. And then also, again, back to slowing down the conversation, taking time to pause and being comfortable with silence. That's something that I've really had to learn, is just to, when I think somebody's done talking, to wait a few seconds, because often they have more to say and they're just thinking and putting ideas together in their head. But those long pauses that might feel unnaturally long are often very valuable to conversations. I talked a little bit again about the considerations of community timelines and events. Also, sometimes unexpected things happen in communities, especially in small communities. If you have things like the death of an elder or flooding of the Yukon River, all sorts of things can happen that can really impact a community and shift their priorities away from evaluation. Where when these big events are happening, we need to respect the priorities of the community and be responsive to those. I wanted to talk a little bit about building trust. This was also something that several of you mentioned when we were talking about the challenges that you've encountered. I think trust is something it's essential to relationships and it's essential to successful evaluation. And so it's a really important thing to think about. And it also takes a lot of time. So it kind of plays into all of these pieces. Transparency and informed consent is a really good starting point, of course. So being really open with the community about what your project is, where you're from, why you're doing it, what you hope to achieve, why you're interested in working in this community, how are you going to use the data, how are they going to find out the results of the data. If somebody's giving you data, they have a right to know, well, what are you going to do with it and how am I going to find out like what the end results are? And then protection of confidentiality. So people really need to be assured of how their confidentiality will be protected. One thing that I have found very helpful with working with small communities also in building that trust, for lack of a better word, is having an ambassador in the community, which is really more like a key contact that I might have. So maybe at the beginning of the project, I meet somebody in the community who's really on board with the evaluation and kind of becomes my lead contact. And then if that person helps facilitate introductions and introduces me to other people in the community, to their neighbors or other key people in the community, that helps build trust because then you have that credibility of that community member behind you. So that's a really helpful approach in building trust with the community. And again, that ties into spending time in the community. So there's time for this person to introduce you to other people or to accompany you, to meet council members or whatnot. Slowing down to really listen. We talked about that a little bit already. This is always something of personally that has been a challenge for me. I had one of my mentors many years ago tell me to put a roll of duct tape on my desk as a reminder to stop talking because it's very easy when we have silence to just want to fill it with chatter. So again, being comfortable slowing down and being comfortable with long pauses. Member checking is something that we work really hard to practice. So what that means is if there is a focus group or if we do an interview with you, we typically will record the conversation with the permission of the people who we're talking with and have it transcribed. And once we get the transcription back, we will provide a copy of that transcription to the person we interviewed or to the focus group members and give them the opportunity to review the transcript and to make any corrections or additions to anything that they said. Most of the time, people don't even read it, they don't care, but it's really important to give people that opportunity. I might have mentioned at one of our early meetings that I think all of us at some point in time have been quoted out of context and then kind of feel like that's misrepresented. So I think it's really important to give people that opportunity. Along those same lines, never, ever, ever quote somebody without getting explicit permission from them to quote them first. So typically what we'll do is we'll even be as specific as, like, for instance, if I wanted to quote Jen because she said something in an interview, I would send her an email and say, "Hi, Jen, I'd like to quote you in my report. This is a quote I pulled from my interview with you," and then I copy and paste the quote in there. And this is the context that I'd like to use it in. Is this okay with you? And are there any corrections that you want to make to what you said before I quote you? So it's just really important in building trust that people know that they won't be misrepresented and that they know that they won't be quoted unless they're comfortable being quoted. In the beginning of our conversation, we talked a little bit about focus groups and people maybe not being comfortable participating in focus groups because of the relationships they have with the people around them. That is a really big challenge with focus groups. We can be, from the evaluation perspective, very careful about what we put in reports and quoting people. And we can tell people at the focus group that this conversation is confidential. We ask that you don't share anything about this conversation outside of the focus group, but we can't control what people are going to do. We can't guarantee that if I have a focus group with Jen and Tesha, that Jen's not going to go out and say something Tesha said, even though I asked her not to. So it's just something to be aware of. Another way of building trust is through responsiveness. So when I'm in a community, visiting a community, working with a community, if someone says, "Hey, Esther, I really think you need to talk to John over there because he's an expert on this topic," whether I think it's a good recommendation or not, if I follow through and talk with John as that person recommended, that helps build trust with the community. So really, it's a matter of me trusting that community member that they're giving me a good referral, but also building that trust by following through on those recommendations. And then finally, having community members review any reports and public documents prior to finalizing them. So again, often we'll send reports to people, hey, here's the report. We'd love for you to review it and give us any feedback. Often people will not review it and they don't want to give any feedback, but it's important to give people that opportunity. And as a matter of fact, we like getting feedback on reports because it almost always makes the report better. So it's important to us because we want to know that we're not misrepresenting everything and anything at all. And we want to make sure that you're happy with the way that things are being presented. And it also gives you an opportunity to add to the report. Sometimes I think people feel like the evaluation needs to be completely separate. I should steer clear of it and I shouldn't give any input, but your input is extraordinarily helpful to the evaluation. So we do want your feedback on the reports. Just a few other considerations in evaluating rural and very rural communities. I talked a little bit about how the process of evaluation is often just as important as the outcomes. Similar to that, when we're doing evaluation, we always like to evaluate the process as well as the outcomes. So maybe you have a coalition working on alcohol use in a particular community. We like to it's good to evaluate how does that coalition work? How do they do their work? Are they having an impact? As much as what kind of impact are they having and what's the data about alcohol use showing. Using both quantitative and qualitative data to help tell the story. So we've got the numbers, but then also qualitative data is like interviews and focus groups and things like that that kind of give us that contextual information that tell the story about the numbers. Looking for opportunities to collaborate on other efforts. It could be other evaluative efforts. It could be things like, hey, the health fair is going to be happening in April. We could have a table there where we administer surveys, things like that. A willingness to adapt tools to fit the community or to make specific tools more relevant to the community. Surveys are a great example of tools that can often be adapted to specifically fit a community. Consideration of how you're going to share and convey the findings with the community. Again, that goes back to the participatory evaluation pieces. How does the community want to be informed about the results? Do they want you to give a presentation? Do they want an easy read 2-pager? Do they want the full report? And so on. Similar to that, grounding evaluation in questions that are meaningful to the community. Again, having the community help you pick the evaluation questions. Flexibility throughout, especially with timelines, like not being fixed to the timeline. There are going to be things that happen that will shift the timeline and being able to work with that within reason. Also, sometimes flexibility in the data we're collecting. Sometimes a particular source of data doesn't pan out like we think it would. So being able to pivot and find alternatives when we need to. Advocacy with funders. I put that in there because a lot of times, it's like we have funders that want certain things and you're in a little community and it's like, this just doesn't make sense. I don't have this data. I don't know how to do it. And sometimes an external evaluator can sit in with you on specific calls with your funders and maybe help explain some of what you're dealing with the data and the relevance and whatnot to help kind of open the funder's eyes to some of the contextual factors that you're dealing with. And then, of course, meeting people where they're at. So how do people like to communicate? Is text message going to work? Is Facebook going to work? Is email going to work? Or is picking up the phone? So just, again, with that flexibility, really being able to tweak how we work with people and what works best in different communities.